Welcome back, everyone, to Chapter 8 in my reaction to the series on the Turkish century, from the Hittites to Atatürk. It's been a while since we visited this one, and now that I'm back from my trip to Vicksburg, we're ready to dive back in. If you have not seen either the original video, there's a link in the description for that, as well as the link that takes you back to Chapter 1 and 2 of my reaction to this series. As I've mentioned previously, not a topic I know a lot about, so this is really more of a learning experience for me and a chance for us to have a conversation about an area of history that I know many of you are much more familiar with than I am. So let's go ahead and dive into part 8. If you have comments, observations, questions, suggestions, use the comment section below. And as always, make sure you check out the original content creator. His name is Kraut, if you want to see more from him.
The politician who needs help of religion to govern is nothing but an idiot. For more than 500 years, the rules and theories of ancient Arabic sheikhs, Muhammad, and the absurd interpretations by generations of filthy and ignorant clergy in Turkey dictated all civil and criminal law. They dictated the state from the Constitution, the smallest of activities and gestures of citizens, their diet, the hours of rest and labor, the choice of clothing, the curriculum in schools, our manners and habits, and even our most intimate thoughts. Islam is a rotting corpse that is poisoning all of our lives.
So was Ataturk not a Muslim then? Because I guess I always just assumed that he was, being the leader of a state that comes out of the Ottoman Empire like that. But that's really interesting to see his take on things, and I'm surprised that he got away with that. But I guess we'll see.
There are many different nations, but there is only one civilization. A prerequisite for the progress within a nation is to be a part of that civilization. There are no differences between the Orient and the Occident. There is only a difference between backwardsness and modernity.
The fez was a traditional Islamic headdress worn by men across the Islamic world. It originated in North Africa, and throughout the 17th and 18th century it became increasingly widespread throughout the Islamic world. From Indonesia to Morocco, devout Muslim men would wear it, just as devout Muslim women would wear the veil. It became the official headgear of the Ottoman army uniform, and even non-Muslims who resided within the Ottoman Empire and Muslims who lived outside of the Ottoman Empire would wear it. It signified loyalty to the Caliph, the Islamic social order, the Ummah, and the Caliph's authority over the Islamic world. You can see the fez on the heads of the cheering crowds as the Turkish Republic is founded in 1923. At that time, 80% of that republic's population lived in the countryside. 90% could neither read nor write. Ideas such as nationalism, republicanism, liberalism, progress, modernity, science, or secularism were something most people had never even heard of.
So that's quite a challenge. I mean, when you're talking about as late as the 1920s, where only 10% of your population are able to read and write. Compare that, and I'm only comparing to the United States because that's a statistic I'm familiar with. I know by the late 1800s in the United States, that number is something like 80% can read and write. So significant challenge for the leadership. It's also, however, I would think, for some leaders, the way they want it to be, right? Because, and that's been true throughout history in a lot of different places. When you have a very small percentage of people who are literate, it's much easier to control them. It's much easier to have control because you are some of the very small percent of the population who has that power. And so then you can dictate laws, and you can interpret scripture, for example, in the way that you see fit, because other people can't argue with you when they can't read it themselves. So interesting to see how that is going to be overcome.
A national identity didn't exist, and most group identities were restricted to clans, religious groups, and family structures within rural villages. This was not a population that could carry and advance a revolution, especially since they wouldn't even understand what a revolution was or what they were doing it for, which consequently would shape what Atatürk's revolution would be, one dictated from the top to bottom, and not the other way around as revolutions usually go. This in return would leave behind a legacy of governance enforced autocratically from top to bottom, no matter what the wider rabble may think of it. Within a period of 14 years, the world of the average Turk was turned completely on its head. On the 3rd of March 1924, Mustafa Kemal formally abolished the caliphate. This might seem like nothing to you from an outsider's perspective, but remember, the Sultan and the Caliph were two separate institutions. The Sultanate had been abolished 2 years before with the founding of the Republic, but the Caliphate had still existed. There were many sultans throughout the Islamic world throughout its history, but there could only ever be one caliph. The caliph was not a pope of the Islamic world, but considered to be the spiritual descendant of Muhammad and to represent his authority as a religious authority to all Muslims.
So whereas the Sultan is more of the political authority, now you're abolishing the religious authority. And that is a major, major shift, a shift that has happened in many Christian nations as well, where, look at the Pope today. The Pope still has great religious authority among Roman Catholics, but the Pope doesn't have the political authority that he did a few centuries ago. Big change.
The Caliphate had existed since Islam itself existed. The title had gone from the Umayyads to the Abbasids to the Ottomans, and was seen as an integral part of the Islamic faith and the understanding of the Ummah as a community of Muslims in the world under a leader. And with one stroke of a pen and the presidential proclamation, Mustafa Kemal abolished it. Gone was a central element of the Islamic world, an authority to all Muslims and their understanding of themselves as a group identity and part of a community that had existed for over 1,000 years.
Big deal.
The consequences of this decision were monumental. Mustafa Kemal had promised the Kurds to protect the Caliphate in the War of Independence, which resulted in the first split between the Kurds and the Turks. But the consequences were even larger beyond the Turkish Republic. It completely shattered a key element in how many people in the Muslim world saw and understood themselves. What are we now? Who are we? What is our tribe? Our identity, our community? Are we still Muslims? Can Islam persist without the Caliphate? Are we nationalities? Are we Asians? Are we Africans? Are we Arabs? Are we Iranian? Are we races? Are we comrades? Are we a community? Can Jews or Christians be part of our community? Can we live with Hindus? Are we kings? Are we republicans? Are we back in the 6th century? What?
That's a lot of questions. And if that much is going on, you can understand why there would be a lot of confusion. There would be a lot of conflict. I don't know how, he makes a really interesting point when you're united behind something, whatever that something is, whether it's a political identity, a religious identity, a cultural identity, when you have something that everybody can rally behind, it's easier to hold people together. When you eliminate that main thing, and in this case 2 main things, one being the Ottoman Empire, the other being the religious identity of that empire, what do you use to unite the people? So I'm wondering how that happened.
What? Where? Who? How? Many, if not most, of the problems throughout the Islamic countries in identity, politics, and nationality can be traced back to this fateful moment. From Gamal Abdel Nasser's proclamations of Arab nationalism, to Iran's Shah proclaiming himself to be a living god, to Jinnah founding a separate Muslim nation in India, to anti-Semitic pogroms in Iraq and Morocco, to the Saudis dragging their society back into the late Iron Age. On the 4th of April 1996, when Mohammed Omar founded the Taliban, he broke open the chest of the cloak inside the Shrine of the Cloak in Kandahar, Afghanistan, where Muhammad's cloak had been kept for centuries, and wrapped himself in it, proclaimed before his followers that he was the legitimate representative of Muhammad, the Caliph of all Muslims, leader of the new caliphate, and that the false gods of nationalism, democracy, and communism had failed. Events echoed when bin Laden proclaimed his war to restore the caliphate to the black flags recently flying over Iraq and Syria. It is still too early to say what the full consequences of Mustafa Kemal's decision were when he...
So he makes a good point. You do have people in the more modern era, and I try to avoid modern politics and modern discussions whenever possible, but there are people who are trying to become the modern identity of what was eliminated at that time. And there are varying people who have tried to do that.
Abolished an institution that he thought of as too backwards to be reformed and therefore had to be destroyed. But make no mistake about the tremendous impact that this decision had throughout the world. But for Mustafa Kemal, that decision was just the starting shot. He followed it up by banning the fez, turbans, niqab, and burqa.
So we've already talked about eliminating sources of identity and things that bring people together. Now that's a big piece of identity. I mean, you're banning something that people have used to identify themselves with one another for some time now. Wow, I didn't realize he did that.
And the criminal penalty. The hijab was banned in public spaces such as schools and government buildings, and women who throughout most of the history of the Islamic world had been silent figures forced into the background by religion were told to come forward and be public beings and figures.
So I get what he's trying to do here. He's trying to, given the quotes that we saw at the beginning of this episode, he's doing much like what, Russian leaders did a few centuries earlier and others throughout history, trying to bring his nation up to where the West is, right? He's trying to modernize. He's trying to get them to identify with the culture that exists outside of their world. He's trying to kind of drag them kicking and screaming into a modern era. I'm just curious to know how strong the opposition was going to be to that.
This was followed by the closing of all Islamic schools.
Wow.
Keep in mind that at the time, all schools were Islamic schools, and the Sunni clergy held a monopoly on education. This was now over. New schools were opened. The curriculum was entirely secular. Religion was scrapped entirely out of education, and education was compulsory, and far more radical. It was also compulsory for girls, who had previously, due to Islamic customs, been denied any and all education. This was followed by all women being granted and guaranteed legal equality before the law. And that was followed by the abolition of the Islamic calendar. It was no longer the year 1344, but the year 1925, as it was throughout the rest of the non-Muslim world. Next, he abolished Sharia law in its totality in each and every corner of the legal code, be it civil or criminal law.
I'm not expressing agreement or disagreement with his decisions. I've said this several times now. I'm curious how he got away with such radical reforms. I mean, did he have the support of the army in doing this? I mean, how did one man do so much to completely change the face of a nation like this and get away with it?
No more special taxes for non-Muslims. No more restrictions of freedoms. No more prohibition of alcohol. No more punishments for apostasy or other. He introduced freedom of consciousness, making it possible for Muslims to convert to other faiths, or even openly leave their faith and be open atheists. Marriages between faiths and lack of faiths were now legal without a spouse being forced to convert, as it would have been under Sharia. Mixed faith couples could now raise children together, which was forbidden under Sharia. The Islamic courts, Sharia justices, and the Sheikhul Islam, the highest religious legal authority in the land, were all abolished. He introduced a civil code of criminal and civil laws, shaped after examples set in Europe and North America, the first, and so far, only majority Muslim country to ever do so. Next, he banned the call to prayer from minarets at mosques.
Wow.
Next, all imams became state bureaucrats on government payroll, under control by a secular government institution. What could and could not be preached during religious sermons had to be approved by the state. Preaching in Arabic was abolished and had to be conducted in the Turkish language.
Wow.
Next, the Turkish alphabet was Latinized. The old Persian Arabic alphabet was replaced at all state and commercial institutions and schools. All adults who could read and write had to learn the new alphabet. All who couldn't read or write were taught to read and write with the new alphabet. All children would be raised with the new alphabet. Government advisors cautioned Mustafa Kemal to do this slowly and that it could only be done over the course of a decade. But Mustafa Kemal persisted and had the...
Honestly, even over the course of a decade, that is radical reform. I had no idea that it was so radical and so quick.
This reform pushed through in 5 months. Next, all Turks had to take last names. Until then, people throughout the Islamic world had mostly only had one or two names, but there was no such thing as a last name or a family name. Mustafa Kemal changed that and took the last name Atatürk, which means the father of the Turks. He was the only one to take this name, and since he had no children, he would, in Turkish history, be the one and only father of the Turks. Next, Islam as the official religion of the state was cut out of the Republic's constitution. This was then followed by secularism being written into the constitution, defining the Turkish Republic as a state that separates religion and state. And there's a note to be made here. The Turkish word for secularism is laikik, which is a francophone, a French loanword in the Turkish language based on the French term laïcité. And that is important because French secularism isn't your average secularism. While most modern republics define the separation of religion and state as a freedom of religion, in which citizens are free to worship, believe and practice their faith, and even base their politics on their religious beliefs as long as they don't force them upon others, French separation of religion and state, which is called laïcité, is defined as freedom from religion, in that you, the citizen, are freed from religion by the state. It bans religious dress from all government and public institutions, be they parliament or school. It forbids any and all religiously inspired or dictated social policy, be they through private organizations or elected officials. This uniquely French interpretation of secularism, derived from the French revolutions and its thinkers like Auguste Comte, is controversial to this day, as it gives the French government the authority to restrict religious expression in public, such as banning the burkini and burqa under criminal penalty. It also gives the French authorities the power to restrict private religious programs and activities that the state determined to contravene the common good. For example, offering a pseudo-medical procedure known as gay conversion therapy in France is punished with a $60,000 fine and a 2-year prison sentence. Laïcité is far more invasive and has a more hands-on approach to the separation of state and religion than in most other republics and democracies, and it is this type of separation of religion and state which Atatürk adopted for his new republic. Turkish society was torn down to then be rebuilt and modelled after the European states of the time. But Atatürk didn't just want to catch up with the modernity of his neighbours, he wanted to outdo them. But where could he? In what regard were European and American nations still lagging behind in progress? These were for most modern states technologically advanced with legal equality for all men, but mostly only for men. At the turn of the decade, women's equality movements had sprung into action as they had never before in human history. This is where Atatürk saw an opportunity to show off the progress of his new society to the outside world, and to even hint on how his new republic might soon overtake all the others. In the decades before, the Ottomans had made a point of showing off their princes to the outside world as symbols of the empire. Atatürk turned this on its head. He adopted several young girls who showed promise in education and accomplishments, such as Afet İnan and Sabiha Gökçen. Afet İnan became an accomplished anthropologist and historian. Sabiha Gökçen became the world's first Air Force pilot, and they both were presented throughout the world as symbols of progress within the Turkish Republic.
So it's not enough for him to say we need to catch up to the West. He's now thinking, and this is just showing how radical this guy is, he's not thinking we're going to change everything and catch up to the West. Now we're going to jump ahead of the West, and we're going to do things that they're not even doing and let them see our progress. Guy's got some guts, I'll give him that.
Most countries represent themselves through national symbols, such as a national animal. Within this concept of national symbols, France is unique as it represents itself as a woman, the famous Marianne leading the revolution. Atatürk decided that the symbol of Turkey was to be a modern, dark-haired Turkish woman leading the nation to progress. These were the images that Atatürk wanted the world to see. No longer should Turkey be seen as this weird backward nation where veiled women are hidden behind closed doors, but a forward-thinking republic where a female president...
I mean, look at the fact that you could see her arms and all of that. I mean, that's a huge deal. Even in good chunks of the United States, that would have been seen as very risque and wrong. I had a great-great-grandmother who died in 1947. Who would not even roll her sleeves up when she washed the dishes because that was considered to be immodest. She didn't wear jewelry. She didn't wear makeup. Those things in her culture, in her faith, were considered to be immodest. And this is a woman, living in eastern Kentucky and then later on southern Ohio.
President of a university and acclaimed historian can congratulate American women on receiving the right to vote and finally being the equals of their Turkish sisters.
Amerika kadınlığını takdir ederim. Çünkü siyasi haklarını tamamen kazanmışlardır. Türk kadınları da şimdiye kadar aldıkları haklarıyla iktifa etmeyeceklerdir.
One of Atatürk's biggest projects was his new capital. At first, there was confusion when he moved the capital from Istanbul to Ankara. Istanbul had been one of the world's most important metropolis for millennia. Ankara was comparatively nothing, a small town with a population of barely 30,000. But this was done for good reason. Compared to Istanbul, which had geographically been a central location in the larger empire, Ankara was geographically more central within the geography of the new republic.
Yeah.
It was easier to access, had the only rail network leading into the south, and contained the headquarters of the army. But more importantly, the small size also served another purpose for Atatürk. He could build a new city for a new state in a new century. At a time when modernist architects were persecuted by fascist movements in Europe, Atatürk invited many of them, such as Bruno Taut, Clemens Holzmeister and Paul Bonatz, to come into a Turkish exile and build a new capital with him. What they built was the futuristic Ankara that we know today. Detached from many concepts of traditional Middle Eastern style of buildings, a modern European metropolis was stamped out of the ground. If you visit the city today, you will find the symbols of another cultural revolution that took place here, manifested in architecture. Best symbolized with the Road of Lions, because these lions are imitations of 10,000-year-old Hittite bronze figurines. Adding to that, the coat of arms that Atatürk chose for his new city was a Hittite sun wheel.
So he's going all the way back. He's skipping through all of the Islamic history of this region, and he's going back way back to the very beginning to the Hittites and kind of making that connection. Very interesting.
The Road of Lions is also not far away from the newly built Turkish National Museum, filled with Hittite, Assyrian, Persian, Greek, Roman and nomadic artifacts. This might seem small to you from an outsider's perspective, but symbolized another monumental break from traditions and customs in Islamic societies. Before Atatürk, pre-Islamic cultures and relics were considered to be barbaric or even as sacrilegious or demonic by Islamic societies. In Arabia, ancient pre-Islamic castles and temples are being destroyed to this very day. Atatürk's new vision for his new state required the forging of a new national Turkish identity, and that new identity based on nationality, heritage and language made the ancient pre-Islamic civilizations part of that national identity. The Turks were to no longer just see themselves and identify themselves as just a part of a wider Islamic community, but to take pride in an identity with a wider historic legacy that included nomadic horsemen and ancient Anatolian civilizations.
So there's where you're making that connection. There's where you're giving people something to unite behind. Our identity isn't just the Islamic identity. It isn't just the Turkish identity. Our identity is this region, going all the way back to who was here first. So now I'm starting to understand what his mindset is in all of this.
All of these reforms, the complete restructuring and reorganizing of a society in such a radical way, like it had almost never been done before or since in human history, happened within 14 years, between 1923 and 1937. The goal behind them was to create a modern state, shaped after a European republic. But precisely the problem there is that republics are more often than not societies with a right to self-determination for the individual. Ask yourself this: is a society that forces you to not be religious any better than a society that forces you to be religious? You might find forced political religiosity and religious doctrine more contemptible than forced secularism, but a key component in both remains the force.
Yeah.
Erziehungsdiktatur is a term coined by the German historian Harald Neubert, who spent the final years of his academic career trying to figure out why the Soviet Union had failed. The word basically translates to educational dictatorship, or the educating dictatorship. The idea is that the state was ruled by an ideological minority who found their legitimacy not through public approval but within their own beliefs, and saw it as their role to rule as dictators until the public would finally be educated enough to see the validity of those beliefs and elect them through their own volition.
So we will shape things, and we will mold things, and we will force you to follow us until you come to your senses and realize that we are what you need, and then you'll choose us for yourselves. But until then, we will force ourselves on you. Interesting concept.
However, in the Soviet Union, the dictatorial experience merely educated the people into rejecting that ideology. Atatürk's state was in many ways such an educational dictatorship. Atatürk saw himself as the first and last dictator of Turkey, the one dictator that the nation needed to educate it into never having another dictator again after him. The problem he had was putting this into effect. In 1925, he encouraged opposition figures to found a liberal opposition party with the intention of gradually democratizing society. However, seeing this as a weakness, disgruntled remnants of the Young Turks attempted to assassinate him, and the Kurdish Sheikh Said launched a rebellion to overthrow the republic, to reinstitute Sharia and re-establish the caliphate. The project of Turkish democracy was put on rest, and Atatürk responded with harsh measures, executing the remaining Young Turk leaders and launching a heavy military crackdown against the Kurds. It was after this backlash that he somewhat backtracked his previously more radical positions.
We believe that religion, which for the longest times has been used as an instrument of politics, must be liberated from politics to be elevated. We cannot abuse our holy faiths as instruments of politics.
It is unclear how sincere he may have been when making this statement. Atatürk himself had stopped practicing Islam in 1923, but besides the conflict with the religious population, the Kurdish uprising of 1925 also exposed other problems with the new vision of the Turkish national identity. The fact that it was built on a new nationalist identity formed exclusively around the Turkish language, heritage and culture. It left no room for Kurds, thereby sowing the seeds for inevitable future conflicts.
Yeah.
It was an idea that left no room for any cultural, lingual and to some extent even political aberrations. However, the pluralism that Atatürk wished for this society to achieve requires such aberrations and diversity to exist. To ensure that his vision for the future after him would be safe, Atatürk established the National Security Council, an institution of generals that had the expressed permission to intervene in the politics of the country by force if the constitution of the secular republic was ever under threat of being undermined. A role usually given to civil opposition, and the Supreme Court was thereby handed to the army, guaranteeing even more future conflict potential. The cracks in all of this would show at some point. Decades later it would be revealed that Sabiha Gökçen, the war hero, a national symbol of Turkish social progress, was actually an Armenian, a genocide survivor adopted from an orphanage by Atatürk. The diversity in this society was still there, it was just hidden behind the scenes. Mustafa Kemal Atatürk died on the 10th of November 1938 at 9:05 in the morning. It is an easy historic date and time to remember, because every year on the 10th of November at 9:05 in the morning, the sirens go off in all Turkish cities and towns, and everyone stops in their tracks for a minute of silence.
So he's still a
For
big part of
outsiders,
things.
It all might seem somewhat weird to observe, almost like a personality cult in a dictatorship. But this is really not the case. Atatürk is genuinely revered by the Turkish people, who to this day see him as the savior of their nation and the founder of their modern society.
Well, yeah, I mean, because without him and without all this stuff he did, everything they know, which is a part of who they are as a country, doesn't exist. I mean, I can see the similarities, you know, even though there's a much greater distance in time to, in the United States, how George Washington has been revered for most of history. I mean, you could just look at the names of children throughout the last 200 years, and even up to the last couple of decades. Most families, somewhere in their family, had someone whose first and middle names were George Washington. I've got a number of those ancestors in my own family. It's a very, very common thing. And so I can see the parallels there. Yeah, it's really more of an identification with the state rather than a personality cult. I understand that.
To this day, they go to his memorial in Ankara in the millions to pay their respects. Years ago, when I first looked into this topic and had a conversation with a Turkish friend, I commented on how weird it was to me that Mustafa Kemal called himself the father of the Turks, and was abruptly interrupted by a "No, we call him the father of the Turks." As we go forward into the story of the Republic, you will find that Atatürk's shadow dominates over this state and its people throughout their journey through the 20th century. No other political figure would have as much of an impact on this country as he did, until 2003.
Interesting. So I'm probably not going to do the next part of that. I've reacted to this entire series, the Hittites to Atatürk. Like I said, I try to avoid modern politics, modern history, just because of the strong passions that it ignites in people. But very curious to hear your thoughts about not only what we looked at and heard today, but this entire series. I'm excited. Tomorrow we will begin diving into the 30 Years' War on Extra History. That was what was requested by our patrons, and I'll be putting up probably very soon another vote to see what else our patrons want to see in the future. Also finishing up the editing for my first video from my visit to Vicksburg. That should be live tomorrow. So we'll see you then. Thanks for watching.